Hi, everyone, and welcome to Beyond Screens. I'm Celia Pearce, and this is IndieCade Beyond Screens, a show devoted to games that happen in addition to games that have screens plus, or games that happen without screens. We rotate between Playable Theatre, Alt Control, and escape rooms. And right now we're in a cycle where every other Wednesday we're doing Playable Theatre, and I'm really excited to have my guest today, Kat Jones. Kat is a member of the Playable Theatre board and a very, very accomplished LARP designer and teacher, and probably one of the people I go to when I'm looking for a lot of knowledge on the topic. And I was super excited when I found out that Kat and her partner Evan were going to Fastaval, which is really kind of, other than probably Knutepunkt, one of the top analog game events in the Nordic countries, and really a destination and kind of a point of pride for people who want to be in the LARP and board game scene. I think, if I'm not mistaken, that Jason Morningstar and Lizzie Stark won an award last year for their fantastic LARP. What is the LARP called?
A player's tale.
A player's tale. Yes, a player's tale. It's anyway, we won't talk about that now. We're going to talk about your stuff. So I said, as soon as I found they were going, I'm like, oh, I really want you to come on my show and tell us about what happened. So yeah, what happened? How was it? What did you do?
It was great. It was great. I first went to Fastaval along with my partner Evan Torner and Julia Ellingbo in 2010. I was living in Germany at the time, and Julia had been invited as a special guest and had written a LARP with Emily Kerboss about it was a courtroom drama based on the Child's Ballads. So we all went to Fastaval together. We helped run the scenario, and it was really like this life-changing experience. We played all these amazing games. We met all these wonderful people. It was just this really, really wonderful experience. And so I was really excited to be able to go back. Again, I've been, I think, one additional time. And this was the first time I'd gone when something that I submitted was actually in competition. So that was sort of an additional exciting thing. So I had submitted my game. Fastaval tends to call the role-playing games scenarios.
Yeah.
So I'd submitted my scenario, which is called Mama. And it is a 2-player, 1 facilitator game about vampires and motherhood.
I love you so much. You just come up with the greatest ideas that are like so wild. Okay, tell me about that. That sounds amazing.
So it's really a game about sort of digging into the overlap in sort of themes and tropes about vampires and about mothers, of which there are a lot. And a lot of the players afterwards were like, I didn't ever think about those two things together. And when we sat down and started talking about it, it was like, oh wait, there's all this stuff. And I was like, yeah, there is. I really, really love vampires. They're totally an obsession of mine. And I had been watching these vampire movies that did sort of funny things or like weird things with motherhood. And I started writing this game right after I'd had my first child. And so I was thinking a lot about motherhood, and specifically not just sort of the experience of motherhood, but the way that motherhood is sort of talked about and thematized, and sort of expectations around motherhood. So this game was sort of my way of unpacking that also through vampires. So it's a scene-based game, and it's a very collaborative game. So I sort of set up the architecture of sort of how you run the game, but it depends on a lot of collaboration and a lot of feedback from both the facilitator and the players. So one of the first things that you do when you're playing the game is you sit down and brainstorm themes about that come up in stories about vampires and themes that come up in stories about mothers. And you sort of whittle that list down and you come up with sort of two main themes that will be the guiding forces for your particular game. And a lot of the stuff, all of the characters, sort of how the scenes are played out is really determined by the themes that the players choose.
That's really nice.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
How many people got to play it there? I mean, it's it's a 2-player game, right? So you had to run a lot of them, huh?
So that's another one of the really cool things about Fastaval, is that they encourage, they try to run lots of runs of the games that are accepted so that you can get lots of player feedback, lots of people get a chance to play. For me, this was really new. A lot of the conventions in the US, you run your own game and maybe your friend runs your game, but it's unusual for me to have more than one run of my game in a given convention. But because my game had so few players and because there were slightly less games than usual in submission, I think my game had something like 10 to 12 runs.
Yeah. You ran every one of them?
I only ran 2. And then they just found GMs. And so, you know, sometimes you ask your friends if you know people that are going, particularly if you know people that are particularly good at facilitating. But what I thought was really cool was that there were lots of people that I didn't know who signed up to run the game. And so I got to know new people, and they were really excited, I think, about this game, about such a weird little niche topic.
It's great. I love it. Can you just, for the people that aren't familiar with Fastaval, tell us a little bit more about what it is and why it's important?
Yeah, so Fastaval is a Danish role-playing and board game convention. And it is role-playing scenarios tend to be what they call semi-live. So I think of it as sort of like a meeting point between tabletop games and LARP. They tend to be, some of the games are a mix. Well, you do sort of narrative as you would do in a tabletop game, and then you might actually get up and act some scenes out.
Oh, okay.
So there
is it all role-playing games? The tabletop, I mean,
as opposed to
other kinds of board games and tabletop games.
Yeah, so there's a separate board game track that's separate from the role-playing track. And that's one of those things where, like, one of my roommates this year was one of the jury for the board games, and so I got way more information about the board games than I ever have before, because it really is. I mean, not like people don't move between the tracks, because they definitely do. But I think especially as an international guest who doesn't speak Danish, the international track tends to be limited a lot more to role playing. And so the board games is like this whole other part of the convention.
It's pretty interesting as you're speaking, because I'm thinking, you know, they really are really different. Like, it's a whole different group of people. There's a lot of overlap between tabletop role playing and LARPing. I mean, you and somebody like Jason and Julia, you know, who've done both.
Yep.
But I don't know that many people who do board games and role playing games. It seems like it attracts a different kind of creative mind. I mean, I've done both, so I'm kind of a weird anomaly, but I usually am anyway. But it just crossed my mind as you were saying that. Yeah, I really can't think of anybody offhand that does both of those things. So that's kind of interesting. Maybe no, not even Nick. I think Nick Fortuna does digital games. big
Shang.
games and LARPs.
Shang has
Shang, yeah, Shang. Okay, there you go.
Yeah.
Shang's a good example.
And I think one of the things, some of the people that I talked to over the course of the weekend, a lot of the role-playing, sort of the stereotypical game at Fastaval tends to be a very sort of intense emotional experience, right? There's
that's the Nordic LARP
exactly
brand, right?
Right. Which, you know, I want to like not stray into sort of like overgeneralizations, but a lot of the games at Fastaval are very emotionally intense. And so people I talked to would sign up for a few role-playing games and then go and play some board games because those were like
less intense,
a palate cleanser.
That's hilarious. That's very funny. I played a board game last night with a bunch of theater people, which was kind of funny, which had a very LARP-like quality to it. It's called Captain Sonar, and it's 8-person, 2-team co-op. So it's 4 people on each team, each with different set of actions. And I at the end I go, this is Battleship meets Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes. That's kind of, so like people, there's these barriers in between and everyone's yelling at each other and you're like in a submarine and you have to do things and pass these cards back and forth down the row and stuff, and you can't see the other person's ship, but there was a lot, it wasn't role playing, but people were adopting roles anyway, which is something I always noticed, even in my earliest work when I was doing board games and playtesting, that people would change, their personalities would change even a little bit. Playing a game, which is what got me interested in the whole social science aspect of it, right?
Yeah.
That's very cool. What was, other than running your game, what were some of the highlights for you? What was the most interesting thing that happened?
Oh gosh. I mean, I feel like it's really hard to sort of choose one thing.
Well, we have plenty of time. Tell me as many as you can think of.
Yeah, I mean, all of the games that I played over the course of the weekend were really, really amazing and really different. I tried to sort of get a varied overview. And I ran, a friend of mine, I ran her game Fastaval Tales, which was a game about 4 friends who go to like a festival. And it's really, really set up to sort of simulate that like sense of, you know, being young and like doing sort of stuff that you wouldn't normally do because you're at this festival, and you sort of choose activities that you're going to do the next day at the sort of end of each scene. And there were fake tattoos and different bands that you co-created that you got to go to listen to. It was really, really cool. And for me, it was really fun because I've never actually been to a festival like that. You know, it's like I've seen movies or whatever, but it was this really fun experience to sort of tag along for that like adventure.
That sounds great. I love those age-based role playing. That's one of the reasons I will play sleepover whenever I have a chance, because I love playing a teenager. It's so fun.
Yeah.
It's just like, who doesn't want to do that, right? Especially because I think a lot of people, at least for me personally, my adolescence was not entirely happy. And so I love like creating a new adolescence that's better than the one I actually had.
Yeah. And this is a really interesting game because it could be very variable in tone depending on the player group.
I could totally see that.
So Evan ran a really like lighthearted, his group had parties every night and they like did body paint and bubbles, and like, wasn't it so much fun to go to this festival together? And my group was like, we would like to play a more intense emotional game. And it was just so rough. It was just this group of friends that were just, two of them were having a big fight, and the other two just like wanted everybody to get along. And so every day was just them like trying to do things together and having it be sort of a disaster.
Wow.
Yeah.
But that also sounds fun.
It was. And I think they really, really enjoyed it. Like that was sort of what they wanted. And so we really went there.
I feel like it's a really strong testimony to a game when you can play it that way with different tones. It really is. Because if you think about other art media, especially, I mean, video games obviously have almost none of that affordance, but even theater and stuff like that, I mean, you know, you can't really, there's not an Ibsen play that you can play as a comedy. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I've always thought it was interesting too, that I think there's a big influence of Ibsen and also Scandinavian film on that kind of heaviness of the Nordic LARPs. I mean, the Celebration, obviously, which is one of the most famous Nordic LARPs, is based on a Lars von Trier, you know, horrible dysfunctional family story. No, it's not Lars von Trier. It's the other guy.
No.
It's I always mess that up.
I can't.
The Celebration.
I know
his name anyway,
but I can't remember.
Maybe someone in the Twitch can tell us, and I can't actually see the Twitch, so Nico will have to tell us if there's anyone in there who knows the answer to that trivia question. What are some other games that you ran or played?
I tried to limit my running because it had been 2 years since I had played a live action game. And so I really was like, I want to get it all in, you know. And another thing, one of the other things that I really appreciate about Fastaval is that they have a very, I would say, like mindful schedule. Like games don't start really early in the morning. There's always a break for lunch. Or no, there's not always a break for lunch, but there's always a break for dinner. And it sometimes when I go to US conventions, my impulse is always to really overload my schedule, which always ends up being a disaster because I sort of burn out too early.
I know, it's horrible.
But this, because it's so sort of staggered, I sort of set myself up for success. And so I felt like that was another thing, was that I didn't play a ton of games, but I was able to be really present for all the games that I did play and run. And they were all really intense experiences in different ways. I played two of the games that I played had dance mechanics involved in them. Dance. And I came home and I was like, now I want to write all the dance games all the time. Like I was like, what do I have like percolating that I can add dance to? Because it was so in both of the games, I felt like the dance component was so incredibly powerful. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is a game called Glamorous Night, which is actually written by an American, by John Cole. And it is a sort of Ars Magica, so it's a fantasy setting where you all play different sort of magical wizards or magical beasts or fae or humans with some sort of magical ability. And you've come together for this magical night, and you don't talk for most of the game.
Wow.
It's almost all the exchanges are done through either contact improv or this other dance technique, which is used to symbolize sort of magical mind control. So there's a lot, the scenario is a lot about sort of binding and unbinding, and sort of the power of true love to unbind people.
Mm. Hmm.
So it was really cool. I really like White Death is another game that it reminded me a lot of White Death in terms of this sort of really sort of individualized quality of the narrative, that like I had my own story about like what was going on with my character and all the other characters that I interacted with. And it's highly likely that it was a different story than, you know, if you asked one of the players that I played with what their story was of the events, it would probably be very different. So I really like that. And you know, that a lot of the sort of relationship building and relationship exploration took place through movement, which I felt was really effective and impactful.
Yeah, I did White Death. That's a really intense one too. When I describe it to people, I'm like, and everybody dies at the end, and they're like, but I love that. It's a really good example of a kind of a more artistic avant-garde. But you know, as I'm working here with actors and working on, we've been doing these devising sessions, and yesterday we had our first session, and you know, that's how actors work, like a lot. Like they work a lot without speaking, and they do a lot of embodied stuff. And so it's been interesting for me to watch and see how that, you know, set of practices plays out. And it overlaps a lot with LARPing, and obviously LARPing borrows a lot from theater as well. So
Yeah.
So you said there was a second example that you want to talk about?
So the second example I want to talk about is the game Encore by Jeppe and Maria Bergman Hemming, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. But they've done several other, they did a game called Sarabanda, which is also an arts-based nonverbal game. A game that I really enjoyed at the prior Fastaval that I was at called Deranged, which is sort of
Deranged?
Deranged.
That's awesome.
It's about a composer and sort of a look at this composer's life as coming to the end of his life. And I always forget who the composer is. But it's really wonderful. It's it really like leans into the metaphor of music in terms of how it's sort of structured, and how you sort of put the scenes together. And when you play it, you pick the scenes and you put them up on a wall, which looks like a piece of music. And so you're writing this piece of music as you're.
That's so cool.
Really cool.
How many people play it?
In Deranged, it is 4. And that's sort of that's again the sort of traditional Fastaval format, is 1 facilitator, 4 players.
Oh, interesting. So they're all quite small. It's really different from something like Intercon, where you know you could be in a LARP with 100 people easily. Huh, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Would you say that those are parlor LARPs? Would you use that term to describe them?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of them are and some of them are not. So Festival Tales was a 4-person, 1 facilitator, but I wouldn't call it a parlor LARP because you were going to all of these different locations during the game. And a lot of the game was about narrating like what does this concert look like? Or
Mhm.
you're all going to get tattoos. What is the tattoo setup?
Yeah.
Which I think is very different from the sort of parlor LARP.
Where you're in a space, where you're like in a parlor as part of the game
Exactly.
experience. Yeah. Huh. Yeah, I'm going to Annika Ware and I are going to the Smoke next month to show the game we designed for Lizzie and Jason and those guys. It's called Return to Innocence, and it's a high school reunion.
Oh, nice.
Is this scenario, and it was designed. We basically got these constraints. We need a game for 50 people that takes 1 hour to play. And we were like, okay, and she and Annika was like in town staying at my house, and we just basically wrote the game in 3 days or something like that. I mean, we had done a little work on it before. We came up with the concept and everything, but it's really fun working with her. She's so great. But yeah, that sounds great. Tell me about some highlights that weren't actually games, things that happened, or people you talked to, or moments that really stick out.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that is really interesting about Fastaval, another thing, is there is a real culture of like analysis and critique. So at the end of each role-playing session, you are handed a feedback form. And you, as both the player and facilitator, get to talk about sort of what worked about the scenario and what was challenging, and who did you play and what was your experience and what was sort of your favorite parts. And I think sometimes for those of us from the US or North America, the first time you get those sheets back, it can be real rough. Because people are they do not pull their punches with their feedback. And if there was something that they don't like about the game, or that didn't work for them, or they are not shy about telling you what it was. But the sort of other thing about that is that when you sit down to talk to people about the games that they played, you get this really rich sort of discussion about sort of mechanics and themes and characters. And and I'm not sure if this is because so many of the people that I was talking to are game designers themselves, and so we're just sort of having those kinds of conversations, but that it was really, that I think is part of the beauty of Fastaval as well, is that you get to compare notes with people about these games that they've played, and you get this really sort of rich discussion of sort of what was going on in the game, and that
it's interesting that you say that, because as you're talking, I'm thinking about, like, I've been to different American LARP events that have a very different flavor, but like Intercon is another example, one that there's none of that. I mean, people do it, but it's not part of the culture.
Yeah, exactly.
And it made me think about how, one of the things that helped the idea of video games as an art form was the idea of game criticism, and the idea of people talking critically about the work and reflectively about it. And I wonder if that's also what makes the Nordic LARP scene feel more artistic, because there's that culture of critique and feedback that doesn't really exist in the sort of mainstream LARP, if that's a thing in the US, where people just, are in there with a bar for LARPs, or even if it's a more serious or different type of format, there's not really a lot of debriefing that goes on.
Yeah. And I do think too, I mean, I think for me, one of the things that you're saying is like, it's not like critique doesn't happen in the US, but that I feel like the outlets for it aren't necessarily the most productive. Right? Like, complaining about a LARP on Twitter, not super productive in
Also,
helping
it's not,
design.
I think there's like two sides of it. One of them is like it's critical, like thoughtful critical discourse, as opposed to criticism in the way that like, oh, I didn't like this or whatever. It's more like what is interesting about it and what is
Yeah,
not interesting and what is challenging and what could be done better. And, and also thinking about what the LARP says about, people's values in the
yep,
world. And, like you were talking about your piece, for instance, is that you're trying to use the vampire genre to say something about motherhood by combining those tropes. And that's a pretty deep idea, right? And one that I think anybody that would play that game would feel compelled to talk about afterwards, because that's the whole, and in some way that's the
yeah,
point, right?
yes,
Um, so it's very interesting that that's part of the culture there. And when you were talking about the feedback, I found that that's very characteristic also of Scandinavian academics.
hmm,
They're much more like, they'll confront you and give you, like in a conference, for instance, they'll be much more
yeah,
critical and much more open about stuff. And I think it comes from a sort of European academic tradition of the idea of the defense, like you're always, it's always an argument, not in the sense of a fight, but in the sense of you're
right,
trying to build a case for something. And that's how and so people are constantly challenging each other in that way. So that fits really, I mean, it's very consistent with that, I think. Also, there are quite a lot of academics involved in the Nordic LARP scene, whether game creators or theorists who've written a lot, or, the Nordic LARP book,
yeah,
which was collected by academics. And so, there's a little bit of that here again. Obviously, you and I
yeah,
and Evan are all of that ilk, but I feel like also like the big, like if I go to again, like bigger conventions, I don't run into a lot of academics either as creators or as players.
hmm,
So that might also have something to do with that difference. Um, I wanted to go back to something you were talking about earlier, because and I thought we talked about this for a little bit, and then maybe we'd see if we could get any Twitch. I don't even know if anybody's watching this show, but we don't usually get tons of people in the live, but we'll get pickup afterwards. So
hmm,
one of the things that I've really been, as you know, I think a lot about is the idea of a script. So I was just talking with the Dacha people yesterday about one of their very successful plays is this play called Ghost Party, which really like sounds like a LARP in a lot of ways. So the idea of the show is that it's a 1920s party on a loop of ghosts who were at this party somehow, and they're stuck in this ghost state because they have unresolved conflicts. And the audience's job is to help them get those conflicts resolved so that they can leave the party and go wherever they're supposed to go. And it's a very like elegantly simple and easy to describe thing. So I was talking to one of the creators yesterday. I said, yeah, I'd really like to stage this in Boston. And he's like, oh, huh. I'm like, is there a script of some kind or a document? And he was like, well, we want to do one, but we've never really, so it goes back to this conversation we've been having in the board and the Playable Theatre board about how to make scripts that other people can run.
hmm,
And this is another thing that I really like about the Nordic and European LARP scene, is that they often will require you to submit the LARP document in such a way that somebody else can run it. And I think LARPing has done a pretty good job of people being able to articulate what the experience they're trying to create on paper to then be recreated or interpreted by a third party. And we've seen that some of the things that we've been involved in together, people running other people's games. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about kind of what makes a good LARP scenario. What if you get a script for a LARP, like what makes it good? What makes it interesting to run? Like why would you want to run one? And
oh,
also
okay,
what makes it like, I don't know exactly how to, but you know what I'm saying? Like you were talking a little bit about yours where the people kind of make up their own themes, right? So in that case, which I really like, is the script itself is kind of co-created with the players. right? That they're actually putting in a lot of the elements of the story themselves with some kind of scaffolding for the experience that they're supposed to have.
I mean, that is really, for me, that's like sort of my design, like that's sort of my design philosophy, right? Like I very much, there's a quote, and I don't remember who said it, about how game designers, it's like, you know, you're sort of creating the scaffolding. It's like you're getting ready to host a party, right? And you know, you do all this planning and you set everything up, and then you have to have the people come to the party. And you know, there's always this like sort of alchemy that happens between the players and the facilitator and the script.
Mm-hmm.
And so I tend to give a lot of instructions for how to do that collaborative stuff, right? How to co-create, how to work together, how to come up with things. That's a particular way of doing it. And I think there's definitely more traditional Fastaval scenarios are very tightly written characters, often a very clear script of like what you're going to do. I know like Jason and Lizzie's game, they even have sort of a breakdown of like, this is how much time. Festival Tales was the same way. It was like, this should take about 20 minutes. This should take about 30 minutes. Don't take more than an hour on this part, to really sort of walk you through. And I think, you know, like Festival Tales had a lot of moving parts, right? There were like the activities, and there were random encounters that you would roll for, and there was the music that you would do, and so it was like, as a facilitator, I felt really sort of guided by the script, because it really told me like, this is how you do it. This is when you do this. Ask them this at this point in time. And so I really could like follow along. And I think for me, there's sometimes, unfortunately, a disconnect between the LARPs that I'm like, this sounds really cool. I would love to do this. And then it's not written in a way that I can run it. Or, you know, it's not clear when you do certain things. And so for me, I think it's very important that like, I want a script that allows me to reproduce the experience that the designer sort of had in mind. In my own, you know?
It's funny when you were talking about that, because I was thinking about White Death. I have a term. Remember when you were like, it's my philosophy, like I actually have a term, which is, I call it the interaction aesthetic. And it's really the way you carve the space for the player. Like, what do you put in and what do you leave out, and how much room do you give the player, and what type of room do you give them? And in this case of LARPs, of course, you have the facilitator and the players. So you have cases like in your game you were describing, you know, how the players sort of come up with the themes. I was thinking about Graham Walmsley's game Marinara, where you have physical food. You're going to make a real meal together, and you have physical food that you combine to create your characters, right? So you take some basil and some salt, and that's that character, and then you take some oil and some, you know, whatever. So it's the process of creating the characters is part of the experience, and it has its own kind of aesthetic quality to it, which I really like. As opposed to, you know, the kind of LARP you're talking about, where you get essentially a novel or something that, you know, almost looks like a traditional play, where you have like 4-page character description, you know, or something like that, where it's really you're really taking a somewhat prescribed parameters of character, to something like White Death, which is very abstract. I played one of her LARPs in London, and I don't remember the name, but one of the things I loved about it was she kind of tricked us. this is Nina Runa Essendrop, who's famous for these very sort of incredible black box pieces, and they're very abstract, but I've seen pictures of them, and they always have the same look, because no matter what you do, the feel is always the same because of the way they're designed, right? In this one, what we did was she had us all lie in a circle with our heads together, and she took us through a series of sonification kinds of exercises, and we did all this, and it was presented kind of as if we were doing a warm-up. And then it turned out that what we were doing was recording the soundtrack for the LARP.
Oh, cool.
And so she took the sound that we all made together, and these different, she basically said, made these sounds, and it essentially when you started playing, you was, oh, these are the acts of the show, right, of the piece. And then we had to create an imaginary world together based on the sounds that we had made. It was really lovely. But, that's a really different aesthetic, right, than that kind of more character driven, like you're saying, and more almost theatrical style. I was also thinking about Sleepover, the parent talk piece, just as kind of a really interesting way to give somebody a backstory by letting them actually make it part of the experience, rather than saying, oh, this is your backstory. Like, oh, let's just make it up right now. I mean, we're here, we have brains, we can write.
Yeah.
It's a really nice way to create a character in situ, instead of providing the player with tons of information.
Yeah.
And
I think,
yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just I want to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, I think that there are definitely, especially this sort of more traditional intercon, I would say, game, which has lots and lots of really detailed characters and world building. And I really sort of appreciate and respect that kind of design, because I think when it's done well, someone described it as like, you read this novel and then you go to the LARP and you get to be part of the novel. And how cool is that?
Yeah.
But also, I think for me, there is this sort of interactive aesthetic that I find really, really resonates for me, which is this sort of like playing to find out, and sort of Avery Alder's sort of keeping things feral and like not like nailing things down in advance, but really sort of like letting things sort of breathe and letting the interaction between the players sort of co-create the story and the characters and the narrative.
Yeah. Because then it's more surprising, like,
Yeah.
And you have that where you were talking about like that. I love the idea that you could play the same game, as a comedy or as a really heavy story, because it just gives the players more agency, right? And a more distinctive experience. I mean, I have had good experiences with those scripted games, but I I often break them. Like there was one I played at Intercon. It was really great. It was like a steampunk scenario where all these people from this secret society were getting together, and they were all told that there was somebody at the party that was looking for a project to fund, and all of these different people were like trying to figure out who that person was and get them to fund their project. And I was that character. I was the funder character. And at the end of the game, I decided I wanted to go off script and ask two groups to get together and make a joint project, because they were sort of working on related things. I said, you should just get together and try to come up with something that combines these two things. And I asked the moderator, who was also the writer, like, can I do that as a writer? He goes, well, no one's ever done it before, but there's nothing in the rules that says you can't. So I said, okay, and I did it. And then after we ended, he did the little sort of epilogue of what happens based on the show, but he forgot about this decision that I had made. And so I raised my hand, like, I'm sorry to bother you, but like, that's not actually how it ended. I did this instead. And then he had to make up a whole other ending But I thought, he wasn't really, he really just had an idea in his mind of how it was supposed to end, and he wasn't really leaving room for us to make a different outcome.
Yeah.
So that was just it was a very telling moment for me when like the moderator and the players have come into conflict about who's in charge, right?
Yeah.
I was in actually the first LARP I ever played was a Vampire the Masquerade LARP at Dragon Con, and it was really big. There were like, I think at least 100 people in it, and I went with a friend, and then afterwards I was telling her how great I thought these people were, who I thought were the people that were kind of running the story. And she said, oh no, those were not the moderators. They were actually players. They didn't like how the moderator was running the game. And so they basically had a mutiny, and they made up their own storyline and just took the game over away from the moderators. I love that because I love emergent behavior. And I was like, that's fantastic. Like that made me so happy that it was the players that were making this great experience for me. But I think a game, it's best when that happens, because for me, I guess part of what's great about a game is that you don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah. And I mean, I really enjoy fate play, which is where you sort of know the outcome of something, because I feel like it's a nice constraint for me to sort of like give me the space within this like box to be like,
right.
Okay, like, you can do all this stuff here, but this is how, but I know that some people really dislike it because there isn't that sort of room to like determine the outcome.
But even something, like Inside Hamlet comes to mind, right, as when we're like, it's very fate play, right? It's based on a play and we know how it's going to end, but how it gets there is varied, right, depending on the people.
Yeah.
I was thinking about writing a participatory theater piece called Romeo and Juliet Happily Ever After, where the players could end the story differently if they wanted to.
Yeah. Evan actually has a scenario that he wrote that's based on Fritz Lang's Metropolis. It's also a very movement heavy
that's
game.
So Evan too, it's like everything he does all rolled into a ball.
It is very, very, very Evan. But the cool thing about it is you sort of play key scenes from the film, but how the scenes turn out is always left open-ended. And so, it's sort of, there are certain things that have to happen. But he was like, I really love Metropolis, but I really hate the ending and like don't really agree with it. And so he was like, so I'm just gonna like keep the stuff that I like and leave the rest up to the players to decide.
Yeah,
I think that's a really, I like that a lot.
I love that. But that's also kind of what's fun about this is like you said, being in the novel. When I was a kid, I used to read these stories, and I would, like I read all the Little Princess and the Secret Garden, and I like would project myself into those worlds and into those characters. And the thing that's great with LARPing is that you can live in that fictional world in some way, but make it your own. Otherwise, you might as well read a book or watch a movie, right?
Yeah, definitely.
It has, its own pleasures, but it's not the same thing as taking the reins,
Yeah, for sure.
We one of the things we were trying to figure out with Funfair is, we have this voting system. So the idea of the show is that it's the Funfair, but the F is broken, so it's unfair, and the audience can vote to change the rules and make it more fair. That's kind of the big picture idea. And originally we were like trying to figure out what rules we wanted to change, and then we realized, it would be way more fun if the players could propose their own changes. And so we figured out a way, because we're going to have some moderators and MCs, that we will get the audience to come up with solutions, and then we can pick from the ones they propose, the feasible ones that fit with the structure of how we can change the space and the characters, rather than having them be prescribed multiple choice things that we decide. Right. So that was kind of interesting when we realized, because we have live people. This is one of what I love about. I made a game of many years ago for the biosphere, which is a thing that is often mocked. But one of the things was when the proposal was first put forth, it was supposed to be like an automated system with this AI and multiple choice. And I decided that that was really boring. They had docents working there who had to memorize like a 300-page book about the biosphere. And I said, well, why don't we make them host operated? So it's basically, the premise is you're having a teleconference with the people who are in the biosphere. It's all pre-recorded, but it's presented as if it's a live news show kind of a thing. And so the host basically authors the entire show however they want. So, and the way they do it is, while people are in line, they fill out on a card, they write a question they want to ask one of the biospherians. The host gets all those cards and picks the ones they want to vet, and then they make their own path through the questions. So like an example would be, one of the questions was, what do they do in their free time? And another, one of the people will go, I read a lot of books. And then he can either, the host can read another card that says, do you guys have books? Or he can just follow this whole track about the library. If you want. You see what I mean? So he can kind of build this conversation between these characters that starts with raw audience language, like he reads it right off the card. And what we did a bunch of testing, and what we found out was that there were just a bunch of questions that people always asked. Like we knew that every audience would have someone ask them if they were having sex in the biosphere. which was like the most common question that anyone asked. But and the answer was hilarious because it was all about the birds and the bees, literally, that were in there. one of the biospheres goes, oh yes, the birds and the snakes are having sex all the time, and the trees are. But anyway, the point is, if you bring a person, like, this is where I always felt like AI doesn't really do. I mean, people can do context, right?
Yeah.
And they can do emotional valence, like you were talking about, in a way that, and they can be responsive. So like, if something happens that's unanticipated, you can do something in real time and respond and feed back to it. So it's part of why I've become so enamored of live work, because I've spent all my time trying to figure out how to make computers smarter. And I realized they're still not going to be smarter than people,
right?
In the end. So why not just let people do this stuff? Because they'll do it better. That's really the bottom line. So I think there are some creators right now who are working on these, like a bunch of people at UC Santa Cruz have been working on these like semi-automated, human moderated systems, right? Of trying to, or one of my master's students at Georgia Tech also wrote her thesis about this, like how to create a tool for moderators that has some AI, but lets the moderator kind of drive. So that's an interesting, I think, possible. I'm not interested in it because but part of what I am interested in though is this idea of how much information you give the person running the game, and also like what kind of a document is it? Like if you look at the script for Tony and Tina's Wedding, the classic 1980s immersive theater piece, it looks a lot like a script on the outside. And it has acts and stuff, but when you actually read it, it looks like a LARP because it's basically got a bunch of character descriptions. Like that's what the actors get. And there's some scripted text, but there's also a lot of stuff that's, you go to the seafood platter and get in a fight with your aunt, but it doesn't, because of something that happened in the past. But like, there's not really, it gives them some space to.
Right.
So I think this is a struggle we're having now to figure that exact out. Like, how do you make a scenario that someone else can implement in whatever way? So that's, I think the Nordic LARP scene has the most resources to help us think about that, because they have this stipulation that things have to be interpretable and runnable. Like
I think, go ahead.
I was just going to say, the first time I did a Nina and Essendrop LARP, it was with somebody else running it. And then the second one with her, and I thought, I'm pretty sure if you ran it with her, I mean, it's special to run it with her because she's such a sort
Right.
of ephemeral being, but you can easily run one of her LARPs if you're not her.
Yeah. And I think that there, for me, my experience has been that there is a difference between sort of hypothetically sitting down to write a LARP script and writing a LARP script that some person is going to have, and they're going to have to run it for people. And at Fastaval, we get like a 30-minute sort of debrief where you're like, do you have any questions? And it's sort of miraculous that like you sort of get that, right? It's like within the culture, it's, oh yeah, we get this script and we go through it, and then we go and we run it for a bunch of people. And I think that really it really changed my perspective as I was sort of writing things down. And I think having that, that was really, I think, when Julie and I were writing the sleepover, we were really trying to capture that. Like, if we were sort of walking people through, how would you run this LARP if we weren't there? And that's really what I did with Mama as well. It was actually most of how I wrote the LARP was I ran some playtests and I took notes. What am I saying? What am I doing? And then I just translated those into sort of instructions for.
Yeah. Oh, that's really cool. Yeah, I mean, I think like I could see, based on my experience playing it, I could easily imagine running the sleepover. I mean, I've also looked at the script, obviously, from the book. For people who are not familiar with what we're talking about, Catskin with Julia Ellingbo is in the anthology Honey and Hot Wax that was at IndieCade 2 years ago, 21 or 2020 maybe. It was in the pandemic, right?
It was in the pandemic.
Yeah, I think it was the first pandemic IndieCade, 2020. Yeah, so yeah, which won an award if I recall correctly. But that's also nice, those published anthologies. Like, I use those a lot in the classroom.
Yeah.
I use #feminism all the time in the classroom. It's really,
me as well.
Really, really helpful. So that tradition of like, yeah, trying to craft. I do an exercise with my students that you were reminding me of as you were talking about the process of imagining a person. It's one of these, I do these affordance based things where I'll give them objects. And so this is in Foundations. Actually, Nico, who's running the stream, did this in my class. I give them these different objects and I put them in 4 teams and I ask them to play with the objects until they find some interesting play pattern that can become a game. And then they can make some rules. They play the game, they make the rules, they play it a few times, they write the rules down, and then they swap. And the swapping was actually the idea of students. Because I had them do this, I had them write the rules down, and one of them says, I know what you're going to do now. You're going to have a swap and play each other's games, huh? And I was like, I wasn't going to do that, but I'm going to do it now.
Oh, yeah.
And it stayed in the exercise. But it's really great because it really teaches them, like, it's really important. One of those classic things that first year students, they always forget to put a goal on their instructions, which is if you read any board game box, that's the first thing it says, instructions, and they always forget. They're like, okay, what is the goal again? But it's such a good exercise to just blind hand somebody something you've written, instructions, and go, what does this say?
That was really a moment for me in my game design classes where these students would come up with these games that would play really well if they were there to run them, and then they would hand me these instructions and I was like, what is this? Like, I can't play this. And so now I have them swap, and they're always shocked at like all of the things that they leave out. One of my students literally was like talking to one of her partners and was like, oh, we don't need to write that down. They'll figure it out. And I was like, they won't figure it out. I was
well, and the thing,
write
the thing
it
that
down.
I think part of the, I think the biggest, one of the biggest things that my students, I think, are surprised by when they start learning game design is the importance of writing in English. Because I think a lot of them just think that somehow game designers just magically, make things on the screen and they don't really, like, they don't have to communicate with anyone about what they're doing, which is the case if you're like a solo indie developer. But if you're working on a team, I mean, this is how I started my career, was as a writer. I was hired as a writer, and I basically invented the game design document format at our studio, because everybody was communicating in different ways and nobody could understand what each other was doing. And so I took all of the ideation documents and I synthesized them, and then I made a checklist. And like, one of the things I would go back to the designers with is, this game doesn't have a goal. You got to add a goal to it, or whatever. And so that they all have this checklist of, it has to have these things to be a game. And we had other things, like we wanted both competition and cooperation in every one of the games we designed. So it enabled, then the idea was, you have to give this to a programmer and they have to know exactly what you mean. You can't be vague. You can't make any assumptions, right? So it's just as important for digital game designers to have that skill of writing, if not more in some ways, because at least if you're a LARP designer, you have the brains to like create your own addition, to fill in the blanks, whereas a computer programmer just follows instructions. Like, that's what they do, right? So if you don't tell them what to do, it's not going to get done.
Yeah.
But it's and also I really like that you were talking about like play testing, and there's something really elegant to me in LARPing about, like, you can literally expedite a play test finding immediately. Like, you can literally, like, I've done this where I will do something and then we'll go, no, let's try it this way now. You know what I mean? And you don't have to worry about, it's just very fluid and kind of embodied and immediate in a great way.
Yeah.
Hey, do we have any questions from the Twitch audience, or do we even have a Twitch audience? Nico, you can tell us with your invisible voice. What are some of the comments? To the audience, we're hearing the invisible voice of our secret wizard who's pulling all the strings behind the scenes. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. I just thought if there was anything interesting to talk about. Are you working on anything cool now you want to tell us about?
Yeah, actually I am. I'm actually working on a game right now for the Make a Scene festival, which is happening in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, Minnesota, in August. It is a game called Bitty Bitty Boom Boom, which is a song by Selena, if you were not familiar. And it is a I was really inspired by the movie Now and Then, which is a movie about, was really, really popular when I was a high schooler. And it's 4 teenage girls in like the 70s having their coming of age time, but also their 4 adult selves who are coming back together when one of them is having a baby. And I loved that like juxtaposition of sort of the teen and the adult. So that's the scenario is about.
So you play the same character as a teenager and an adult. Oh my God, I totally want to play that. That is so great.
And I'm like, I'm so excited about this game because I'm leaning really hard into the 90s nostalgia, which is always super fun. But also it's very much about sort of like, using Selena as a touchstone for sort of identity exploration and emotions, and sort of thinking about like, what if Now and Then had been about 4 mixed race Latinas instead of 4 white girls, and what would that have looked like, and really sort of thinking about explorations of queerness, right? So how do you deal with sort of finding your queer identity as a teenager in the 90s, but also like not having this sort of static identity that never changes over your lifetime, and leaving space for the adults to be doing a lot of identity exploration as well, so that there's sort of new stuff that they're discovering about themselves even when they're in their 30s.
Are there any other LARPs where you play the same character at different ages? That seems like a very bold innovation to me. I'm sorry. It really does. I'm like, I've never seen that. I think it's really brilliant. I do. It's like sometimes people come up with ideas and I go, why didn't anyone else think of that? But it's so, because this is one of the things that film, it's why I like the flashback mechanic from Sleepover. Because it's like, this doesn't have to be happening in real time.
Yep.
We can make time however we want it to be. You know what I mean? We've been watching, my partner had been watching Russian Doll.
Yeah.
And I've really been thinking about, God, because of time loop games, I think one of the groups at the Playable Theatre game jam that you were at did, I think, a time loop game, didn't they?
They did, yeah.
I think time loop is
games.
It's a very underexploited genre for LARPs, I think, but flashbacks and different time displacements. I mean, Graham did that with Will That Be All, where they take place, there's a break in between each act in time, right? It starts like right at the end of World War I. Have you played it before?
I have not.
It's it's a Downton Abbey kind of inspired piece, but it ends at the end of World War I, and each act is a New Year's party intervals apart. Okay. So the first one's like right after the First World War ends. Then I think there's one in the 20s, and there might be one right when the Second World War is starting, or something like that, or the house is closing down and everyone was leaving. I forgot. Right. I forgot the arc, but it allows you to evolve your characters over a longer period of time, which I think is also really, really neat.
That's cool.
That sounds real. If you need any play testers or any mod testers, let me know.
That would be awesome.
How many players is it for?
It is 4 players and 1 facilitator.
That's great. Perfect for Fastaval next year.
Yeah. There's I think it's run at Intercon a few times. It's called the Garden of Forking Paths.
Yes, I know it. I haven't played it, but I know about it.
That's like a time loopy, cool.
Yeah, that sounds awesome.
Yeah, one of the games I played at Fastaval was called The Tides. And it was actually, you follow a family as the kids grow up. So it's sort of like the game starts, the 2 children characters are like little kids, and follows them until sort of young adulthood. And it's sort of that's sort of the theme of the game, is sort of the passage of time and learning to let go.
Oh wow, very nice.
It was another really beautiful, intense. I cried at the end. It was great.
That sounds so cool. Well, I think we're kind of wrapping up, and so thank you so much for joining me. I had such a fun time talking to you, and I loved hearing about the Fastaval. Kind of what's the word I'm thinking of? Well, because I can't go I didn't go myself.
Yeah.
And I've wanted to always go ever since I heard about it. So it's great to get it vicariously. That's the word.
Yes.
It's great to get a vicarious experience of your perspective on it. So thanks so much for coming. And thanks to our live audience. We actually had an audience today. That was fun. And hope you guys enjoyed the conversation. I want to remind everybody that June 4th is part 2 of IndieCade Horizons, which is our showcase of up and coming game designers who are coming out of various academic programs around the world. It's going to be a lot of fun. We have students and professors, and mostly we're going to be focusing on showing games. So if anybody came to the first IndieCade Horizons conference, which was a few weeks ago, which was amazing. I was like, and I wasn't involved at all in organizing, and I have to say as a caveat, but it was like a really high caliber professional game conference, but it was for students. So
Wow.
I just, the whole time I was like, wow, these people couldn't get a better panel than this at GDC, you know, and it's really fun because it's a celebration of the students and the games programs and the communities and the sort of different styles of the different schools. So it's a fun thing to be part of. And also we just love helping the young new talent out there. So, and also want to thank Nico, who's streaming for us, and Parker, our producer. And we'll see you guys in a couple of weeks at the next Playable Theatre episode. Take care.
Awesome. Thanks so much.